Hello everyone, welcome to the C.S. Joseph podcast. I'm John, and today we're going to continue the series on the Critic. Today we're going to talk about how to deal with TI Critic, with the INTJ and the ISTJ, how to deal with other people of those types. So this is the first episode where we get into some complex territory in terms of the context of this series being about dealing with other people. The question becomes, how do you deal with someone else's introverted critic, right? Because, make no mistake, other people's introverted functions play a tremendous role in any kind of social interaction, right? It's not just accommodating their extroverted functions, it's speaking to and learning to kind of work with their own internal perceptions, right? So the concept here that I'm going to introduce today is kind of a binary breakdown of extroverted versus introverted critics. See over here, there's a difference of strategy, of kind of social skill in approaching, and also optimization of approaching how to deal with our own critic, but also obviously with other people's critic. And that approach is either to corral or to expand. Now, as you might imagine, an extroverted critic like FE critic or TE critic, they are naturally already expanding to everyone else, right? Extroverted critics can be brutal to other people of, you're not smart, you're not good, you're really bad at making choices, etc., right? But introverted critics are kind of the opposite by default, right? They attack the self. And that's where the expansion is necessary, because extroverted critics, the path to wisdom is corralling that this kind of latent, kind of hypercritical perspective that the extroverted critic naturally has. It's really about corralling that a little bit and learning to control that to not be destructive. But for introverted critics, they need to learn to expand, to actually use them, and to validate whether or not the internal critic is right or not. Because an internal critic will be right sometimes. Of like, oh yeah, maybe that is a really bad choice. Of like for the NI critics, for the INPs, right? But not always. And learning to discern when the critic is just being blindly critical versus when it's actually being insightful, that requires us to use our introverted critics, right? And use them by expanding them. So for the INTJ and the ISTJ, TI critic is tricky in that, they are naturally very critical of their own smarts, of their own capacity to solve problems on their own capacity to arrive at a solution, right? One thing I have noticed with TI critics, especially UD, unconscious developed ITJs, is that they are very critical in general of things, of people, of ideas, but they don't necessarily offer solutions, right? So, but there's a question to ask here that applies to all of the introverted critics and the critic as a whole. And that is, why are TI critics, why are INTJs and ISTJs so critical of their own thinking? And why do they share that criticism, being critical of other things? I'm going to introduce a concept here, a fairly simple one, but I think it's quite insightful, that will help you guys understand why introverted critics are so destructive. Remember that the critic is in reflection with the child, and that they share this battleground of innocence, which is really, in a way, it's about competing over innocence, of who can be more innocent, right? Who can be more pure. It's a battleground of purity in some way, right? If you think about an older person, especially as they get a little more senile, a little bit more forgetful, what do people often not do for older people? They don't listen. And the critic, for all its wisdom and all of its life experience, actually has a similar experience often to the child, and that's not being taken seriously. Think of, a variety of movies or stories or your own anecdotes. An older person may say they, especially if they get like Alzheimer's or dementia, things like that, and they talk about, seeing people who haven't been there for 40 years. I saw my husband yesterday, and he's been dead for over a decade. It becomes very easy to dismiss older people, especially the older, the further they move into kind of being forgetful, which is not completely inevitable, but somewhat. So the point to be made is that the critic's experience is actually not always that different from the child in terms of not always being taken seriously, not always being listened to. And that as a whole, and especially for TI Critic, is an approach of trying to actually listen to them. And that can be hard because, when you're accessing someone's critic, it's critical, it's painful, it's stabbing, right? Whether it's stabbing themselves or others, or whether they're stabbing an idea. For example, if you're bringing a new idea to a TI critic, it's very easy for them to just, bash it down because they can use the rationale of their TE parent to just sort of slice things into pieces without even really considering. And that's, again, this is kind of funny because that's one way that TE parent can actually become kind of senile, where, if I don't have the rationalization for it, then I'm not going to listen. And that's sort of a covert way in which extroverted thinkers can become very close-minded when they rely too much on, the surveys or what other people think rather than actually taking the problem seriously themselves, right? So all that to say is that a child and an older person have some similarities in experience. And I think this is an interesting way in which sometimes a grandchild and a grandparent can bond, because their experiences are not altogether completely different, right? And that's why they share this theme of competing for innocence, of competing for purity, right? So for TI Critic, one thing you don't want to do, okay, don't treat the critic like don't treat it like a child, right? Treat it as something with value, okay? And this kind of leads to one thing not to do for a TI critic. Don't try and just convince them that they're smart, right? Don't just try and make them feel better. Like, oh, you're smart, you know what you're talking about, etc., because they don't think that. They come up, they start from a standpoint of, I don't know if I know what I'm talking about. I don't feel smart. So dealing with the critic, you don't directly go after the critic. You have to look at the other parts of the circuit, including the child, the parent, and in this case, the trickster. Okay? Dealing with people's introverted critics, a skillful use of that is speaking to the trickster, but rather it's you're providing more clear information that their own trickster cannot comprehend, really. So what does that mean for the INTJ or the ISTJ? It's providing something that looks like extroverted feeling, because they have FE trickster of like, oh, anyone could value anything, or this could be helpful for that person, maybe not for that person. This may be not the right solution for that person. And this is one way that FE trickster and TI critic actually makes the critic more critical, because the ITJ is aware that the healing solution is different for different people. Of like, okay, if I think this, that might be helpful for that person, but maybe not for that person. So this vagueness, this unawareness of what solution actually applies to which problem and to which person, that's something that just ramps up the critical nature of TI critic, right? So supplying them with, showing them what solutions belong to which people, or showing them, hey, that person really benefited from your thoughts, from your problem solving, right? Because what you're trying to do here is encourage the TI critic, encourage the INTJ and the ISTJ to use their TI critic actively, right? Not just passively kind of step back into being dismissive, because boy, can TI critics be really dismissive, right? So you have to show them how what they're doing is helping or hurting people. How, this is, maybe you don't take this seriously. Maybe you're trying to convince an INTJ or an ISTJ to go to AA, for example, of like, well, maybe you've done your research and maybe you don't take this seriously, but this has helped a lot of people, FE, right? This has healed a lot of people. This has led some people to transformation, right? So supplying the missing input, or in this case, the process or the output of FE, helps TI Critic be a little more relaxed. Of like, oh, maybe this isn't stupid. Maybe just because I don't understand it, maybe it's still worth the try, right? And this is one way to also deal with TI Critic when it's just in its bashing mode of just, shutting down everything. And that's appealing to, hey, your criticism is not being helpful. Because a TI Critic is only acting wisely when the things that they're criticizing are helpful, when it leads to actual solutions, or when it makes the problem more evident, right? So for all introverted critics, but especially for TI Critic, if it's just bashing you or bashing someone else, just say, hey, that's not very helpful. You're not offering any solutions here. I see you see part of the problem, but no one can do anything with that, right? And that's one way you kind of call out the critic, saying that, however they're being critical of, hey, that's not helping. That's not helping. And that allows them, that is an invitation to say, hey, give me something that is actually helpful. Give me something that I can use. Because that's also where FE trickster, or FE, what FE does. FE is about utility, right? But social utility. And just, bashing XYZ problem or XYZ newscaster or XYZ whatever isn't that helpful. So that's one way to kind of help redirect the critic and think about something that is actually going to help someone or help the application process of this, right? And this is kind of the main nugget here of dealing with TI Critic. We know that our job is not to try and convince them that they're smart, right? It's not about that. It's, in some way, you could say it the other way. The job is to help convince them to convince themselves that they're capable of actually solving a problem, because the TI Critic wants to believe that their ability to solve problems is valuable. And how do you start with that? How do you invite a ISTJ or an INTJ to enact their TI Critic? It again comes down to the cognitive reflection of using the other half of the reflection, which is FI child in this case, right? Which is problems worth solving. Because problems worth solving are helpful. And that's one way to cover for the blind spot of FE trickster, is when the FI child is invested in a solution. So speaking to their values, right? The battleground of innocence is about listening to both sides of TI Critic and FI child. If a TI Critic is being really kind of, critical and just sort of bashing things like I mentioned, try and steer that conversation towards the FI child, towards what they're valuing, what they hope for, what they hope people could incorporate as values, right? And then that bleeds into the child's territory where there's optimism, where there's hope, where there's this renewing energy, right? And using the ISTJs and the INTJs' own sense of worth and the things that they want to invest in, that's where the critic's going to feel most alive, right? So integrating the problems worth solving for dealing with other INTJs or ISTJs, it's listening to their child and recontextualizing that in the context of the critic. So like, you value, people having enough resources. You want to help that family get some more money or whatever problem it is, or whatever value they have. Use the context of that value to say, okay, how can this problem actually be solved, right? And the end point for capping it off is showing, again, that the solution is helpful or it's not helpful. And if it's not helpful, then we go back to the drawing board. And that's how you cover for FE Trickster, right? But it's really about speaking to the inner child, speaking to their values, and then helping point the critic towards a solution that is blocking other people from being able to live in those values or in that investment that the INTJ or the ISTJ can give, right? So that's all for me today. I will say that TI Critic and the ISTJ and the INTJ's perspective, especially from the critic, is one of the hardest for me to articulate. So if you guys think that I've missed something in terms of what they actually need or how to apply that, or other perspectives that maybe I'm not capturing, please feel free to share below. I'm treating these talks, these lectures, as an opportunity to converse with you guys and to share, for you guys to share your own experiences and your own thoughts, especially with the ones that are a little bit more challenging for myself, right? So anyway, I want you to keep in mind that this binary of expanding versus corralling is one of the fundamental pathways to using our critic well, right? Mixed with the cognitive reflection perspective of, hey, we need to integrate the other side, right? In order for a TI critic to rediscover their innocence, their child has to be listened to as well, right? So anyway, that's it from me, folks, and tell me what you think in the comments, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.